thank you to everybody who's attending this morning. And it is my great pleasure to introduce a really exciting speaker today, Dr. Julia Moore. Dr. Julia Moore runs the Center for Implementation in Toronto. And for a field that for over the years has been focused primarily on research, and despite a field that has the goal of making it easy for research to be translated into practice, has actually created its own gap between research and practice, and has created its own language and its own jargon, and seems to make it really difficult for people to use the tools and techniques in the field. Julia has had a tremendous impact in interpreting the field for practitioners, in making things simple, in cutting through the jargon, in eliminating what perhaps is not useful to those who actually do want to do implementation, and in building what is a formidable set of tools and training materials that is of use to people who really want to use implementation science to implement. And for those of us here at the Anderson Center at Children's, for whom we want to think about using implementation science really as an additional toolkit, as an additional set of capabilities that help us to take what we have learned from our QI work and our QI capability and be able to kind of have an add-on set of tools that will allow us to implement better. Julia, both kind of the approach that Julia brings to implementation science and the tools that she brings is of remarkable value. I've worked with Julia over the years, and I also can attest to the fact that she's a scintillating speaker. So I think we're in for a treat. So let me hand over to you, Julia. It's all yours.
Awesome.
And thank you for joining us today. I just wanted to say please feel free during the course of Julia's talk to use the chat liberally. Put your questions and comments. I can curate, and Julia's going to have places where she stops with some short exercises. So that's also a place to answer questions. So feel free to comment as the talk proceeds. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rohit. Hi, everyone. It is super lovely to be joining you. As Rohit mentioned, I am going to make this a little bit more engaging and interactive than is probably typically the case, it sounds like. So get ready. I'm going to have some annotation activities. As a start, I would love it if people just shared a really quick hello in the chat about maybe who you are, what you do, even just why you came here, what you're interested to learn about, because it gives me a bit of a sense of who's in the room. I know everyone is not able to be on camera, but if you are, I love being able to see some people's faces, so it feels like I'm not alone in a room all by myself. So as Rohit mentioned, I am kind of described as a rogue scientist by many people. I was trained as an implementation scientist, but now spend all of my time trying to make implementation science really, really practical and relevant for people who are on the ground actually implementing, people who have jobs like how to do quality improvement, or who are improvement leads or system leads or program managers who are trying to actually implement, spread, and scale things. I am at the Center for Implementation. We are a very tiny social enterprise up in Canada, but we work very, very internationally around the world. And I think the best way to kind of depict this is that we are trying to take, and I call it implementation science in the loosest sense, because it's implementation science plus, all of the other things we need in order to create change. And how can we bridge the gap between this science, which people are not necessarily even know exist and are using, and bring it to the people who are actually on the ground doing those things. And based on the chats coming in, it sounds like lots of you are QI specialists, lots of QI people on lots of QI specialists, QI training. And so lots and lots of people who have those kind of on the ground roles. So I'm going to go through and describe to you a bunch of different things. I'm going to talk a lot about some core competencies work and the way we talked about those and how those might be helpful in thinking about how we support implementation in different ways. But I always like to start by setting the stage and grounding it a little bit in the way that I see implementation, the way we think about implementation at the Center for Implementation. that I think as I describe these three pathways that we use as the grounding place, you'll see that you might use different words, but fundamentally, we're all often doing very, very similar things conceptually, right? So it's like tiny little tweaks on the same idea. But we're big believers that we can all learn a little bit by learning from different approaches and kind of pulling the pieces from a different approach that we like into our approach. So we like to start by thinking about three pathways when it comes to implementation. The first pathway is the one that, if I am talking to researchers, is often the least discussed and the least valued. But based on the people who are putting their things in the chat, my guess is you will not have that same thought and experience. And that is that at the core of all improvement work is the need to build relationships with people. No one can do any improvement work on their own. Like, it is just literally impossible to do that. And so we like to think about the relationships that are needed and how we actually go about making sure that we have different relationships with people in order to support improvement work. So doing things like convening people, the act of bringing people together, partnering with people, so determining what level of relationship we might need to have with different individuals, organizations, communities to do the work. Doing a little bit of governance pieces. I'll be honest, that's not normally my cup of tea, but I have seen the huge value in being really transparent around things like decision making, how decisions are made, who is making those decisions in order to advance the work. How we work together as a team. It sounds like, even based on your introductions, a lot of you are at the team level, and some people are working across systems. And so you might not only be working in, say, one organization, but how are we working across systems? So we always like to start by thinking about those relationships. The second piece that we think about a lot is we call the strategies pathway. And this is, we took a bunch of different process models and frameworks and tried to pull them together into kind of one way that we think about how we pull together the way that we plan for and design what it is that we are going to implement. And so this is, again, we might use different words, but you'll see like a lot of this is things you're probably doing, just using different words. So we like to start by doing what we call explore the thing. So like developing a team, understanding the needs and gaps, what are our goals, what outcomes do we want to achieve, and then selecting this thing that we're going to implement. Sometimes the thing is like a pre-packaged program or practice or guideline or best practice or a quality standard. And sometimes it's kind of a vaguer thing than these like pre-packaged things, but we often have this thing that we're like, let's go and implement this thing. Next, we really unpack understanding who is being asked to do something differently and what exactly they're being asked to do. And I don't know if you have this experience, but we often find that people sometimes rush this stage, and we, in roles just like yours, have to like bring people back to redefining, hey, who actually needs to change and what exactly do they need to do differently? We then spend a lot of time unpacking barriers and facilitators to change. So why is it that people or organizations or systems would or wouldn't change? So that we can pick strategies that we also might call tactics if we're using more quality improvement language that we can use to support people to change. And we do a lot of work here on making sure that we're using theories of change to really connect those together. So like, what is the underlying reason people are or aren't changing? And what theories of change can help guide us to select strategies that really directly address those barriers. And so we have a bunch of tools. In fact, our most popular, Rohit mentioned, we have a lot of tools. Our most popular tool is called the strategies tool, and it helps you literally go through the process of selecting strategies based on barriers and facilitators. But I'm not going to get into that in too much detail today. I'm going to jump to the third big picture pathway that, interestingly, in my experience, people want to jump to this one first without doing the relationship work, without doing the work of unpacking who needs to do something differently, what are their barriers and facilitators, what strategies will we use to support people to change. People are ready to jump right into this one. And based on some head nods, it looks like I'm not the only person who has seen that. And this pathway is extremely nonlinear because I have never seen it enacted in exactly the same order twice, right? Like, this is just all over the place in how it goes. It includes different activities like identifying and building supports, like what are people's roles in the system? Do we have a quality improvement team? Who are the teams on the ground? Have we assessed and addressed readiness and context and all those contextual factors that we're facing? Do we have a plan for things like adaptations? Do we have a plan for implementation? Do we have a plan for sustainability? How are we operationalizing those plans? How are we doing things like PDSA cycles? How are we doing pulse checks and making sure that what it is that we're doing is actually working well? And are we evaluating what we're doing? Sometimes with researchers who are doing it very rigorously and sometimes less rigorously, we want to make sure we know that what we're doing is actually working. So those three pathways are like the grounding and the like mental model. That's like how I see the world when I think about implementation. And because I work with people around the world who have lots of different topic areas, right? We work in like health and public health and education and social services and juvenile justice. And it means that I have to adapt the language I use or the way I'm approaching it. But in the back of my mind, those are the pathways that always exist. And I can always kind of like return and ground myself in my work. So I'm going to lead us into our first activity. I'm going to try a little annotation. Have you guys annotated before in Zoom? Yes, no? Okay, so I will teach you how to annotate. Zoom apparently just had an update, so this might not be exactly what you see on your screen, but we will try it. If it doesn't work, you can always type in the chat, but I love a good annotation when it's anonymous because I think that's just a little more fun. So you can literally annotate on this screen. We're testing it out, and then I'll do my activity on the next screen. So it should say at the top, you are viewing Julia Moore's screen. Right beside that, it should say view options, or if you have the new version, apparently it's 3 little dots. Hover over it and pick the annotate box. I think most people now get this version of the like little annotation thing. I don't know. I think they've almost outlawed this one across, but you might still have it if you have an old Zoom. And then I would pick a stamp tool. So start with a like little check mark and you can pick any stamp you want. Just don't pick the little circle below the stamp. It only lets one person do that at a time. So your thoughts will just be erased by someone else. And I don't want that to happen. So pick a little check mark, the one you want, stamp on the screen. It looks like lots of people are able to do it. Awesome. Okay, I'm going to ask you to pause because I'm going to ask you my first question. I'm so glad this works because I have a lot of annotation activities coming up. So I am going to clear everyone's drawings. Okay, my first question. So thinking about this first pathway, the relational pathway, which parts of this pathway feel like a strength to you? You're like, oh yes, I am awesome at doing that. Like it might be like working as a team or I'm great at partnering. I shared, one. So start with that and put a little check mark or maybe a heart to say, this is awesome for me. And then put a question mark for one that is an opportunity for growth. So I shared governance has not historically been my forte. That would my check mark would land in that governance box. So where would you put hearts and where would you put a couple check marks? Amazing. Okay, lots and lots of annotation. It looks like a lot of people feel like convening, partnering, and working as a team seem like major strengths around here. A mix on governance and a mix on working across the system. And I think those are kind of not surprising. I think working across the system is much more challenging. And governance is not necessarily where we're all trained, not necessarily our go-to where we start. Okay, next one. Thinking about the strategies pathway, same thing. Which ones are a strength? You could put a check mark or a heart. And what are you like? Ooh, I bet you I could do a little bit more work unpacking something like barriers and facilitators or picking strategies or whatever that is, right? Like which ones are strengths and which ones you're like, ooh, I'd love to think about that a little more. Awesome. So I see lots and lots and lots of hearts over here in explore the thing. And my experience is every time I've done this with people who are trained in quality improvement, that's the case, right? Like this is where quality improvement is just rocking it. I think that this is probably where quality improvement does it better than implementation science and really getting into exploring that thing. Um, a bunch of mix over here in defining the who's and the what's, which I think is awesome. I think that we often don't realize how important this could be and that it feels like going backwards. And I think that that's sometimes challenging, but can be super amazing. Generally, a lot of kind of strengths over here in barriers facilitators and quite a bit of opportunity in thinking about selecting strategies. So in a moment, I will share with you while we do the next activity, I'll share with you the tool that we have that helps you select strategies that might be helpful for you if that's something you want to explore more. Okay, last pathway. So thinking about this pathway, same thing. Where do you feel like this is a strength, something you're awesome at? And what are the ones you're like, I would love to get better at doing that? Ooh, this one is so interesting. Unlike the other ones where there was a lot of consistency, there's a lot of mixed things in every single bucket. So like there's hearts everywhere and there are question marks everywhere. So it looks like a bigger mix of, ooh, like I'd love to explore more about this in every single one of them. And some people feeling like that's a strength. So a lot more diversity in responses here. I'm just going to save that because I think that's a fun one. All right. So I also just put a link to the strategies pathway. Wait, let's see if this works. I'm going to clear drawings and I'm just going to show you really quickly. I'm not going to get into this in detail, but in case you want to know more about selecting strategies, this is this tool called the strategies tool. You go onto the page, you scroll in. It's that pathway I just showed you. And this assumes you've done the work of understanding your barriers. Say you have barriers like someone says, it's not really my job to do that. You go click on here. And it will then tell you the different kinds of strategies that might help you. Maybe strategies related to educating people, strategies related to modeling, or maybe you need to persuade people that this really is about their job. And you can go and click on that and it pulls up strategies from the literature that have been shown to be persuasive. Things you literally are using all the time. Champions, engaging leaders, facilitation, early adopters, right? Like not rocket science stuff you already know, but that have been shown in the literature to lead towards persuading and so can help address those barriers. So just wanted to flag that as a possible way to explore that strategy selection process. Okay, so I am going to jump from that into talking a little bit about core competencies. So I will share that many, many years ago, I did some work on building core competencies, and I'm going to confess, I didn't love doing it. I was like, why are we doing this? This seems like a lot of work to do. And a whole bunch of different work on core competencies continued to come up over and over. And we felt like we needed to do some work on revising core competencies. And so starting 2 years ago, we did a pretty intense job of like going back to existing literature related to people who are supporting implementation. What are the competencies they need? How can we map these out? And how can we really highlight how to make them really, really, really practical? And so, yes, and as Rohit mentioned, put any questions, any thoughts in the chat. We'll have lots of little pause moments so we can answer those as we go. And so the first thing is I want to flag who these competencies are relevant for. It is relevant for people who are on the ground supporting implementation or improvement work, exactly like almost every single person who's typed in this chat. I sometimes do talks and have people who land in a lot of other roles in the system. And so this might be adjacent to their role, but not necessarily directly related to their role. But based on what people are writing, it looks like this is very relevant to the people here. So the people who are aspiring improvement or implementation, we call them support practitioners. People who are looking to continue growing in their practice, people who are building training. So I know a lot of QI people are now being asked to support other people to build these skills, kind of on the job training. Leaders who are trying to figure out who we need to be hiring, who we need to be training, and anyone who's interested in what implementation support people do. Hold on, I'm going to make it that we disable annotation for a moment. So I will let you annotate again, but that way it won't interfere as we're typing. And so we tried to make these as practical as we possibly could. And we ended up identifying 10 core competencies and 5 functions. And I'll get into the 5 functions in a little bit. But I'll start, I just have this one slide on the 10 competencies. So I don't go into it in super detail. And I feel like having shown you the 3 pathways we use, you'll see that there's very obvious linkages between those pathways and these 10 competencies. And so these are the things that ideally, we'll call it an improvement or implementation team should have. One individual might not have competencies or strong competencies in every one of these areas. And that's been probably the most common question we get is like, do I need to be good at all of these things? And my experience is you need to know about all these things, but you don't have to be the expert on all these things. For example, I'm not great at like synthesizing and reviewing evidence, right? Like, or doing a scoping review is not within my scope of things that I do. I'm not a great evaluator, but I know fundamentally what those things are, but I'm never going to be the person leading that part of the work, but I can work with other people who are doing it. And so these 10 competencies include things like developing a team, and that team might be your local team, like within an organization or department you're working in. And sometimes it's developing a team outside. Unearthing the problem. So really getting at what are the root causes? How can we like peel away the layers to really get at what is underneath there? What is the true problem that we're trying to address? 3, we need to be able to select the right thing. Right. So sometimes we're being given a program or a guideline or a practice or something, and we're saying, go implement this best practice. But sometimes we're being told, hey, there's a problem. What should we implement to solve this problem? And so how do we select that thing that we're going to go and implement? We need to be able to assess barriers and facilitators. So like, why are people changing? Why are people not changing? What makes that really challenging? We need to be able to select and then build these, we call them change strategies. Implementation science calls them implementation strategies. Sometimes they're called things like tactics. But these are things, right, like champions, audit and feedback, education sessions, visiting other sites, like things we're using all the time to help support people to change. How do we adapt things to the local context? So when we're going to implement, it's like oftentimes one setting, one site is not the same as others. And so how do we need to make adaptations to make sure that things fit into the local context? How do we plan for implementation and then literally implement? Like, can we actually do those things? Are we engaging in continuous learning for improvement? So like, are we continuously learning, updating our skills? As someone who spends all day, every day thinking about this work, it's like, I constantly feel like I learned that there's more to learn than I possibly thought, like imagined possible, right? Like, it's like, you have to be in it for the learning process because we're learning more about how people change, how organizations change, how systems change literally every day. And so we need to be ready to keep learning. How do we plan for sustainability and then literally sustain? Can we do those things? Do we know how to do that? And are we planning for and enacting spread and scale? That's a great example. Not everyone has that as part of their role. And so maybe that one is less important. But I am seeing a lot more situations where people had historically been responsible for smaller scale, like improvement work. And all of a sudden it's like, ooh, now implement this across a system. And that means things like adapt to the local context and plan for spread and scale become hugely important when maybe they hadn't felt as important when someone was working like mostly within one department in a hospital. And so that's a very high level overview of these 10 different core competencies. And what we have done is for every single core competency, we have two different levels. A foundational level, so what would it look like to do this, like a foundational level competency, and a like more advanced level competency, because we're seeing more and more people, like I just described, like, are you the person who is like on the site doing it in one place? Awesome, you probably need those foundational competencies. If you're going and you're now responsible for scaling things across multiple sites, you probably start needing some more advanced competencies. So we've been trying to tease those apart. And we have a lot of different resources related to this available. So there's like literally the actual competencies. Actually, I'm going to switch over and show you on the website. Nope, it didn't come up. So let me go over here. So if you go on the website, core competencies, you can see there's like a white paper describing it if you're more academic-y. And then there's the actual tool. So you can like download a copy and it goes step by step and like gives lots of descriptions. I'll show you like lots of descriptions of what this is, what this looks like. We find it helpful both for the people who are on the ground and sometimes for sharing like with your managers, your bosses. Hey, look, like this is part of my job description that maybe you don't even know I'm doing, but it's actually a key part of what I need to do to make this happen. And so we have, that foundational level, the more advanced level, actually go up to one of the ones that we were just talking about, like select and build strategies. And then it describes what that looks like in a bunch more detail. And then one of the things that people really like is we have this self-evaluation. So you could go and self-evaluate how you feel like you're doing on each of those competencies. You can choose to get an email 6 months later. So you can kind of reassess, hey, do I feel like I've progressed? It's just for you, not being shared with anyone else. But we find out a great way that we can kind of self-reflect on, hey, how am I doing across these different areas? And so that is going to lead us into our next activity. I see there's a question or a comment in the chat. So I will go to that momentarily after we annotate again on this activity, and then I'll open it to questions before I jump into some of the functions. So annotation activity again. So thinking about these 10 competencies, same vibe. What is a strength? A little hard or a check mark? And what is something you're like, oh, I'd love to explore that more. That's something I don't feel as comfortable with. So I'll give you a moment to do that. Amazing. Okay, so I feel like we're seeing again this classic thing. I feel like people who are trained in QI are so good at unearthing the problem, and that is just showing up so transparently here, right? So these early ones develop a team, unearth the problem, select the thing, and barriers facilitators, getting a lot of love over here. And then quite a bit actually also in engage for continuous improvement, kind of having that continuous improvement mindset. And generally for implement and plan for implementation is getting quite a bit of love. And then there's a lot more question marks and kind of interest in, ooh, what would it look like to do more related to selecting change strategies? And that's been my experience too. I work with a lot of people who were trained in QI and they're like, what are the things that implementation science could bring to QI that we're not doing as well? And I would say the number one thing is using theory to select change strategies. We're seeing that more and more, but historically that was not the case. And so I think that's a great opportunity. And it's wonderful to see that people are thinking about that here. Because QI was typically locally driven implementation, it's kind of not surprising that adapt to the local context and things like plan for spread and scale were historically not like that's not where the mindset was coming. But we're seeing so many QI people being kind of shifted into these roles of supporting adaptations across multiple different sites, settings, and so needing to build these skills. And so it looks like that is coming out here as well. And I agree. I think that sustainability has not been a forte across all of the fields. And so I think that there's a lot of opportunity there to be better about sustainability. So before I jump into my next topic, I'm going to pause and see. Cindy had a great comment linking this back to some work that they have been doing. But does anyone have any comments, questions, reflections you want to share before we jump into the next part? And you can just come off of mute, raise your hand, whatever you are feeling like. All right, I will clear these. I will pause annotation again and take you on to talk about functions. Okay, so we came up when we were doing this core competencies work, we came up with the idea, actually, I'll go to the next one. So we came up with the idea that there's these 10 competencies that people need that fall under like classic core competency work. So like if you're, if you work in public health, there are like public health competencies, which are like well established and like easy to find, and you can go do this, and like they get updated every year or every few years. So there were these competencies that are like the knowledge, skills, behaviors that we need. But then to support implementation, there's like this other part of the job that people often don't talk about, which is sometimes people call it soft skills, but we see it as so much bigger and more than that. It's like the way in which we are showing up, the way in which we're engaging with people, the way in which we are weaving together and tying together all of these sometimes very disparate parts into like a collective, how do we move this forward? And so we ultimately called these functions. And we highlighted that there are 5 functions that we play that are like the underlying like way in which we are doing the work that we do. And so these functions, and so I'm going to go through the first 3 now, do a little activity, and then the last 2 and do a little activity. And again, these are not things that are like rocket science. They're not crazy things that we've never heard of. There are things that we're doing every single day that in our experience are often not articulated or described or acknowledged and recognized in our work. So one, we spend a huge amount of time understanding. So understanding is about really going deep and getting diverse perspectives to create a shared understanding of problems and solutions. And so, in fact, if you even look at those hearts in the very last activity we did, unearth the problem is really about getting a deep understanding of what is happening. And I think so much of our work is being able to like go deep into this place of deeply understanding. And one of the ways that we think about this is, for example, are we understanding the mental models that people bring to the table when they're engaging in work? And so it's funny, my colleague is the one who introduced the term mental models. I was kind of like, oh, that makes me, I don't know, it feels academic-y and weird at first. But when I think about it and understand that this is really like the worldviews that we have, the different beliefs that we have, the experiences we have had, and the values that we hold, when we try to understand these different mental models that different partners bring to the table, different colleagues are bringing to the table, leadership might bring, a clinician might bring, a patient partner might bring, family members might bring. When we can understand these mental models that people are bringing to the table, it actually transforms the way we're able to do our work. And we often find that the amount of work and effort and time we need to spend doing this is so much greater than people kind of give us credit for in the work that we're doing, because this is actually a huge part of what we need to do is really deeply understand. The second function that we spend a lot of time doing, which came up especially in that relational pathway, is connecting, right? No change work happens if we are not working with other people. So having collaboration with different people, connecting different people within an organization, across an organization, within a team, right? We need to be building trusting relationships. We need to be navigating power dynamics and figure out what is happening here in order to create change. There are a lot of different elements of Connect, but one of them is to work on creating a collective vision. And so this really stems from when we can understand the mental models that people bring, we can start to identify what are our shared beliefs and shared values. Maybe all of our beliefs and values are not shared, but some might be shared. And then we can create this shared sense of a task or how we're going to accomplish this, create common goals, and that this is really key and essential to like moving the work forward. But again, I think that when we're first trained, when people talk about what our jobs are, when we get hired, no one is saying, ooh, like a huge amount of your work is going to be this deep level of connecting with people in order to support them to change in this way. The third one, I will confess, is my favorite. I feel like we all have favorites when we go to places, and inspire is my total favorite. I am just so fascinated by the science behind like what makes it that we get inspired, by what influences us, by what motivates people. I I don't know, I just find it so unbelievably fascinating how that happens. And I cannot believe that the science behind how we inspire and motivate people is not more fundamental to the training that almost all of us should receive. Because so many people have huge parts of their work that are to get someone else to do some behavior. And like that might be part of your job. I also have two kids, they're 11 and 7. And like a huge part of my job as a mom is to inspire people to action, to like get out of the house on time, get your stuff ready. You know what I mean? We inspire all day, every day. And yet, no one ever trained me in school. Like, what does it mean to inspire people? How can we do that better? So, there's lots of science behind how to do that better, but I will share a couple of quick things. So, the first thing is that inspiring people is really the spark to motivate people to go. And I think that when I started thinking about inspiration that way, it kind of changed how I was approaching it. And because this is my favorite, I came up with 6 tips for you. We have lots of them for all of them, but I can't help myself because this one's my favorite. So my first one is be passionate. Okay, these are all based on science. And this one's super fascinating. Be passionate, but not too passionate. Because if you're like over passionate, it like turns people off a little bit. So you have to like show up excited and recognize that sometimes there's a line you have to like back off just a little bit because your passion might not be their passion. And so it's like be passionate with a boundary and a line. The second one is my favorite. People remember how you make them feel, not what you say. I'm going to say it again because I think it is so valuable, so important. People remember how you make them feel. They don't remember what you say. And we think we spend so much time practicing, thinking about what we want to tell people, but not how we want them to feel while we are telling them something. But all they remember is how we make them feel. Um, so related to how we make them feel, when we validate people's perspectives, not necessarily agree, but validate their perspectives, their mental models, where they are coming from, it is very helpful in building connection, that last one, and ultimately inspiring people. Wait, side note story. So I told you I have 2 kids. My 11-year-old, so I'm in Canada, so we're hockey players, right? Like that's the vibe up here. I have 3 feet of snow in my backyard that I'm hoping will melt soon, but I still have 3 feet of snow. So my oldest child is in serious rep hockey. We're in the middle of playoff season right now. He is a defenseman on the hockey team. And even if you don't know hockey, I'm sure you can tell that defensemen are not the people who score goals. They're not the superstars on the team. They are kind of a little bit behind the scenes. And my son is one of the top 3 players on the team, but he doesn't score goals because he's a defenseman. And he is not being recognized for his contribution. And he doesn't want to be a defenseman next year. He wants to play a forward. And he's a better defenseman than he's a forward. But I get it because everyone celebrates the work of what the forwards are doing, and they're not celebrating the work of the defensemen. And I'm sitting here thinking, if you just celebrated the awesomeness of what these defensemen are doing, he would show up and be a defenseman for you again next year. But when we don't validate that, it is so much easier to be like, well, I would rather be that job over there because people really like what those people are doing. That's my side note hockey story on inspiring people. Number 4, don't start with no. The research is so clear. If someone proposes something, do not start with no. You might land at no, but we always start with, that's interesting. Tell me more. You know what I mean? Ask another question. Don't start with no. That is true for kids. That is true for work. That is true for spouses. I can tell you that is true across the board. Do not start with no. Exactly. Yes, and Kimberly. Exactly. Yes, and, or tell me more, and positively reinforce the good. So things that are going well, actually, another sports example, but this one's from the NFL and hockey. There's a great Harvard Business Review article that showed that coaches who reinforce the good that players are doing do have players that ultimately do better than being told, oh, you didn't do this well. And yet our entire system is designed to say, hey, you did something bad. That's wrong. That's bad. Feedback here. But in fact, the science shows if you tell people that was awesome, do that again, that's actually more likely to lead to change and inspiring people to want to change. Finally, the act of telling stories is a powerful, powerful tool for inspiration. So in fact, even I was plugging away, doing my presentation. I randomly told you a story about my son because he was upset last night about his hockey and not being reinforced for his good stuff. And literally first, that's a common thing. Great story. And my guess is that's the kind of thing you're going to remember from this, not all of the competencies that I described to you. Like, what was competency 5? No one will remember, but they'll be like, yeah, she was a girl who talked about the kids who played hockey. You know what I mean? That's what we remember. And so use storytelling in the work that you're doing to support people to see different perspectives in how they're doing the work. Okay, so those are the first 3 functions. I will pause, do a little activity, and then loop us back to the last 3 functions. So I am shifting this activity. It's not just a what's the strength, what's an opportunity. Instead, I'm going to ask you to pull out your annotation, but this time use the text box, the little T. How have you or colleagues done a good job of understanding, connecting, or inspiring? And so I will give you a couple of minutes. So you just pull out that T on that bar and you can just start typing on the screen. And if it's too hard, you can always type in the chat. It just means it won't be anonymous. Amazing, amazing, amazing. Actually, it's great. There's like some themes popping out, right? Like a bunch of like get user experience, asking questions coming out, a lot of, yeah, active listening, being mindful, but also kind of like a diversity of different things coming out here. Ooh, so many things going out. Hold on. Do. Asking curious questions. Oh, I like this one. Someone said using humor where appropriate. That is actually super powerful. I am inherently not a funny person, so I unfortunately like don't have the capacity to use humor all the time. But everyone else in my family is very humorous, and it is such a powerful tool in doing what we're doing. So if you naturally are humorous, that truly is an asset, and you should be grateful because it does not come naturally to everyone. Okay. Wow, there's so many of them. Okay. I'm gonna this here. Okay, I'm gonna save this page because there are just so many great things on here. Save. Oh, someone else had one. Oh, be authentic. Oh, there's amazing research on this about the power of authenticity in building trusting relationships. I love some things about celebrating, asking curious questions, building in time for connection, just really highlighting so many of the different things we are talking about. All right, I'm going to clear all of these and bring you to the last two functions. So the fourth function is about enabling, and this is about identifying and removing obstacles, leveraging resources, building capacity. This one, I feel like for me, I don't know, it's always the hardest to envision because it's kind of like, it's essentially like, make it easier to change is the way that I think about it. And it's like, it isn't one specific thing we do. It's so hard to give examples because sometimes they're tangible and sometimes it's like we just make it easier for people to do something differently. Um, the one thing that is really clear from the literature, though, is that when we embed participation and like give people this deep sense of ownership of like, I get to make choices, I get to make decisions, I have autonomy, it is so, so, so much easier for them to change. And the last function is called transform. This one is about, so this one I'll confess has been the one I have been working on the most. So Inspire, I love it. I'm in it. I've been in it since I was probably a teenager. Like that's the way my brain works. I have been spending several years deep in the transform function. Sometimes I feel awesome about it, and sometimes I really don't. This is about reflecting on our contributions, managing distress, our distress, how we're managing the distress of other people that we are supporting through this process. Sometimes the people we're asking to change, sometimes in my experience, distress amongst leaders that we're working with, colleagues we're working with. There's a lot of distress I find in change work. Planning for uncertainty. I think that historically that has meant a certain something. Recently, I'm in Canada, but I talk to Americans every single day. And I think that managing uncertainty right now feels probably like the number one challenge that people are facing. Uncertainty at work, but uncertainty pervasively everywhere. Supporting people's agility, so our ability to pivot and do things differently, which is not inherently how humans are wired. And so being able to be adaptive while we're doing stuff. And so here I have two little examples. So like becoming comfortable with uncertainty, I think is probably at this moment in time, if someone said, what is the most important thing to support people to do right now? I would say it's becoming more comfortable with uncertainty, that uncertainty is not always bad. And there are ways to become comfortable with uncertainty. And one of the tools and ways we like to do that is something called the what if game. And have people heard of the what if game? You guys ever done this one? Yes, no, okay. So it's used, I think it was originally a therapist tool, but we use it in implementation work all the time. And so the idea is that one of the reasons uncertainty is really, really challenging for us is because we play out in our heads all the bad things that might happen if certain things play out. And the what if game is to literally make people have that conversation and don't just imagine what if this bad thing happens, but literally walk through like, well, what if leadership no longer explicitly supports the project we're working on? Okay, so what if that happens? What are we going to do? And literally go step by step, walking through that process. Ideally, as a team or a couple of people, we find that's really helpful. And interestingly, when we actually walk through all of the different pieces in this, it often gets to a place where it's like, we are resilient people who are going to be able to carve out pathways to navigate different things. We might have to pivot, we might have to be agile, which Cindy's flagging is key to so much of the work that we're doing. But there are pathways forward. And so really thinking through and playing those out can be very, very helpful. So with that, I'm going to jump us into our next activity, which is going back to the first kind of vibe. So which of these, oh, actually, I guess I had this as two different slides, but which of these is a strength? So maybe you can do both of them. So I'll let you annotate again. Oh, you can. So put a heart if this is a strength, and you can put a question mark if you're like, ooh, I would love to spend a little more time digging into that function. I always love seeing how different people are. I feel like if I marked these, as I said, Inspire would be my number one, but that's clearly not the case. Like there's so many more people in Connect and Understand than in Inspire. And so I think that for many people, Transform is the one that we're not kind of, we historically haven't been trained to focus on. It's kind of like you're only doing this if you're doing it on your own personal time. It's not part of our work. It's not part of our school, even though it seems integrally important to everything we're doing. Um, but it looks like kind of, yeah, these Understand, Connect seem stronger and then kind of fading into, ooh, maybe I would love to learn more about that. So I am going to clear these and just share with you a couple of quick things and then open it up to questions, comments, thoughts, ideas. So we have lots and lots of different tools and resources like this in our toolbox. All of the images that I shared today are in the toolbox, so you are welcome to use those. You do not need to email us. They're all there for people to use. We have lots of tools like the strategies tool I mentioned. We have a tool called Cultivate related to navigating power dynamics and building trusting relationships. And you can join our newsletter and stuff like that to learn more about us. Everything I talked about related to related to the functions is from our course on the hidden curriculum. Kind of this idea of how do we ignite change from the middle and do those kind of soft things that no one really explicitly talks about in our role. So that's where I pulled those pieces. And with that, I open it up for really thoughts, questions, reflections, ideas, anything that people would like to share and jump into and discuss. And I can actually stop sharing so we can see people's faces in bigger. And yeah, I would love to hear from people. Any thoughts about how this may or may not relate to some of your work?
So thank you, Julia. Maybe I'll kind of start us off with a question. Um, so you talked a lot. I think a lot of your work, the focus of today was about the relationship building piece and kind of personal competencies and the functions. How, what have you seen in kind of, um, do you think that these need to be built first before we can jump into the strategy selection work or into kind of the nuts and bolts of actually doing implementation? Or do you think that these kind of get built along the way and you can actually move forward on your project, doing some of the more kind of practical and operational stuff while you're kind of building the relationships as well?
I think that's a great question. So I kind of think it's a bit of both. So I think that it's like, it depends on the situation. So I think that sometimes you can engage with and approach a group that you're working with, and there is a baseline level of maybe not I trust you, but no mistrust or distrust. And so my experience is if you start and the like baseline interaction is kind of like, yep, things seem vaguely good, then I often feel like, okay, we can move forward with doing implementation improvement type activities like unpack the understand the problem, define the who's and the what's, get into barriers and facilitators, and we could do those while we're building trust. Sometimes we go to start the work and it becomes clear from very early interactions that there might be a level of mistrust or distrust that maybe has to do with us personally, but sometimes doesn't even have to do with us personally. It might be historical relationships with an organization, with a community that make it that we actually need to build a bridge of trust before we start any of that work. And that it is not really possible to genuinely do the work until we have built a trusting enough relationship for people to like show up and tell us the real problems that they're facing and encountering. And I always say that I know I'm feeling like I'm in a good place for trust when people want to start conversations by saying things like, this isn't recorded, right? Because I have a crazy story to tell you about what happened at work today. And like, if that's what's coming out, I'm always like, awesome, we can jump right into like any of the hard stuff. But sometimes that takes a little bit of time, or sometimes a lot of time, if there's especially this more historical tension, has been my experience. But I would love to hear if others have similar or different thoughts on navigating those.
Yeah, please feel free to kind of enter your comments and thoughts in chat. And while people are doing that, I can tell you if it might be helpful for you to kind of talk a little bit. So you have you have an extensive toolkit.
Mhm.
And so some of kind of what you talked about today, presumably there are, you also have tools that people can use, for example, to assess, context and understand the need for relationships. And are you able to spend a couple of minutes talking about, some of the tools?
Cool. Yeah, I would be happy to do that here. Let me go back to this screen over here. So this is our website. And so if you go into our toolbox, one of the tools based on the conversation we've had today that I feel like seems really relevant is this Cultivate tool. I'll show you this tool and the Equity Guiding Questions tool. And so this tool is about the fact that when we want to build trusting relationships, right, which you just asked about, Rohit, we need to like assess the context, we need to reflect on our own contributions, and then we can get into selecting trust and power actions. And so assuming we have done this early work, we go in here and it talks about, okay, well, say you want to build trust. What might we do? Someone talked about authenticity earlier. And so we might say, ooh, what would it look like to show up authentically? Someone might say, I know what it looks like for me as an individual to show up authentically. But what would it look like for my organization to show up authentically? And so we have pulled from the literature strategies that help an organization express authenticity. Or you might go back and say, oh, I want to see what it looks like to build connection at an individual level. And it has like lots of examples of how we can do that to build connection. So it's like one of the tools, one of our really popular tools about how to actually connect with, build trust and navigate power. And you can also go into the power actions and look at different things like, oh, what does it look like to build power with people instead of power over people? And again, has different actions you can take. So lots of different things people can play with. We found this is actually a great way, Rohit, you asked about what happens like if you don't have great trust at the beginning. We actually sometimes find it a great tool to go in and be like, collectively, let's talk about what this would look like and go through some of these different tool components with people. And I see there's a question piggybacking off of Rohit's question, how and where to start with implementation improvement in ongoing work? Do we pause and reassess, or is there a tool to see if our implementation is working well? Ooh, great question. Okay, I'll stop sharing for a sec. So I would say, I don't think that there's one tool that I know of. I don't know, Rohit, if you know of one tool to say, ooh, is implementation working well? But I think the way I would start is I would start by asking people, what does implementation working well mean to different people in the group, and try to create a collective vision? What does that mean for everyone? And then I would try to collect some data to say, hey, how are we actually doing on implementing? The thing I then do is I started with those three different pathways. The place I always start in my head is, okay, humans are not wired to make a lot of change all at once. So where is the one thing out of all of these different pathways that could probably make the greatest improvement to the way that we're currently doing this work? And so, for example, the ones that I see most often, a huge number of times, people are not using barriers and facilitators and theory to pick strategies. We're just defaulting to the strategies we know and love: education, audit and feedback, champions. I feel like we love those. We go to them, whether they're the right tools or not, or strategies or not. So I would say that's like one of my go-tos is like, ooh, is that the place that would really help people? Sometimes it's like, ooh, do we need to do context and readiness assessments? Maybe the context is different. We need to consider that. Maybe we need to do some adaptations. Maybe that's the most important thing to do. Sometimes it's like, ooh, sustainability, like we did well, we're having sustainability problems. Let's do sustainability planning. So I try to pick the one thing that seems like it would be have the greatest impact, the greatest improvement on the work that people are doing, and go from there. That's kind of how I would start. Any other thoughts or questions? I noticed that parts of the pathway, the model include questions of why, who, and what. Lately, the Solutions for Patient Safety has partnered with system engineers to consider what work as imagined versus work as done. So where and how does implementation science consider the how in theory? Okay, hold on. I'm not sure I totally understand this. So the beginning I'm following, but Kristen, would you like to come off of mute and share your thoughts or questions if that's possible?
Oh gosh. So Solutions for Patient Safety has been moving our systems, our quality professionals, all of our safety professionals, pretty much everyone on this call, towards thinking about work as done versus work as imagined. And in the theory that we're discussing today, let me see if I can pull my note back up so I can actually read it. Defining the who and the what, and then moving into assessing barriers and facilitators. Um, is this where we start looking at the traditional, like in process improvement? Like, what is that transitional phase, I guess, between the defining the who and the what and assessing the barriers and facilitators? Does that make sense? Sometimes I'm terrible at asking questions. I readily admit that.
No, I think so. So I don't know that I'm 100% following your question, but I'll share a couple different thoughts and then maybe piggyback back in. So one is I think that for us, I think the big difference is we use the who, the what, the why, the who, the what, and the how to mean kind of specific things. So like why are we doing this work? Pretty similar to the way most people would think about it. Who is being asked to change? What are they being asked to do differently? And then for us, when we talk about the how, it is those implementation or change strategies, things like education, champions, audit, and feedback, and all of the other strategies. And so the how is how can we support people to change their behavior? I also think that sometimes people are thinking about the how as the overarching, like all of those different pathways are considered the how for some people. And so I think that is a little bit different sometimes depending on how people are seeing it. So that's one thought.
That was perfect.
Okay.
That
I was
that really
thinking,
helps me out. Thank you so much.
good. I think that this question of imagine versus work as done. So we don't typically use those words, but one of the words we use that I think are saying the same thing is like, is this an anticipated barrier or is this an actual barrier? Because sometimes before you start something new, you can be like, what are your barriers going to be? And people will tell you what they think their barriers are going to be. And then you go to actually do a thing, and then you encounter what we like real barriers to change, which are not always the same as the ones that we first anticipate. And so I love that so I think it's like saying the same thing as imagined versus like work as done. And how those like aren't always as similar as I think we would have once believed them to be. So I think that's amazing. Any other thoughts or questions or reflections?
And you can always email me later on if there are questions that people have, and I'm happy to forward them to Julie as well.
I'm going to share, Rohit, one other tool that I'll share transparently how a bunch of people have been talking about using it. So these are our equity guiding questions. This is the second most common thing that people come to our website for. And so we try to embed equity into every single stage about thinking about implementation, including those pathways. And I know that that is a currently very tense topic that people are experiencing. But a lot of people have said, well, you guys are Canadian, so you can keep doing this work and posting it on your website in ways that we may not be able to do. So can you please continue to do that and do it explicitly? So that is our plan. As Canadians, we can continue to do this. And not affiliated with a university. So we're like independent from all these different things. So these are our equity guiding questions. And so you can go in and you can click on any one of those pathways. So like say I click on this implementation spread and scale pathway. And I could go and click on a button and say something like, ooh, like assessing readiness and context. And we have questions that we've pulled that are equity questions that you and your teams can ask yourself at every step along the pathway. Things like who is deciding who is ready or not? Have you considered the equity related impacts of deciding not to move forward with ready sites? I think this is one of the biggest equity challenges we have. We often pick the sites that are most ready, when in fact that's perpetuating inequities in the system. And so they're just questions. There are no answers yet. We once had a dream that there would be answers the way there are in some of our other tools. It did not work as simply as that, but they are questions to be asking yourselves as you're going through the work. And so you can do them. You can go back home. And we also have questions of the pathways, but also like underlying mental models, the systems and structures, and then questions that are relevant for every single step related to the evidence, how you're teaming and partnering with people. And these are my favorite too. At any decision point, have you considered who benefits and who loses, and whether the consequences or the magnitude of the losses are different for some people versus for others? So anyway, I just wanted to flag that because I know we are getting lots of comments and emails from our American colleagues asking if all of these will continue to be available. Delilah, over to you.
Hi, I have a question. I work for the National Marrow Donor Program. Well, we're known as NMDP Be the Match, and we work a lot in translational research, where we are kind of implementing pilot studies related to evidence-based practices that have already been found to be effective. So we're kind of not in an academic setting, more of like a nonprofit field. And one of my questions has to do with engagement. So we're piloting these projects. We're getting partners to kind of be on board, but it's the continuous engagement. So sometimes when you partner with people, they can go kind of silent for a while. And, you know, like people are busy in clinical practice. They have patient care that's at the forefront, where a lot of the time some of these improvement projects or pilot projects are in addition to what they're doing on their day-to-day. So one of the things is, you know, we send out these communication and we work really remotely, right? So it's all kind of like remote meetings and emails. And how do you kind of keep up that engagement? And, you know, sometimes I send emails and I'm sending another email, and like, so trying, and I think that that's part of that readiness, right? Is like being ready. And then other times people commit to things where they're like, oh, this is taking a lot more capacity than we may have. So it's kind of balancing that. I guess I'm asking, like, do you have any tips that you would recommend or tools to kind of help kind of keep them engaged in the work that we're doing?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think I hear different versions of that a lot, because I think that keeping a level of engagement, especially right now when people are just so overwhelmed with the number of things, seems really challenging. Interestingly, I have kind of a counterintuitive response to that, which is giving people more ownership and responsibility over pieces. So I'm going to flip it, but like I get invited to a lot of different things like that, right? Like as a participant. And what is so interesting when I go to look at my calendar at the start of the day, if I'm like, ooh, I could attend that meeting, but they don't need me there. It is very easy sometimes to not join the meeting where they don't need me to be there. And so I think that there's a way to engage people in a way that gives people a sense of ownership and responsibility over small pieces. And I think that's the key, right? No one is raising their hand these days saying, sure, give me a huge plate of stuff to do right now. So I think it's about slicing and dicing things so that people feel a sense of, I have ownership, I am responsible, I am contributing, I am part of this larger piece of work, and this is how I know I am making that impact. And also it's feasible within the like confines of the work that I have elsewhere. And so that's my kind of first instinct right now, based on some of the recent work I've been doing, which I know is probably not as conventional, and many people would say maybe the opposite, but that's what I've been doing lately. But I don't think there's one answer, unfortunately.
No, and it makes me think of like co-creation is like there's a benefit of that too, of one, the co-creation helps like create more ownership, but it also kind of creates a sense of partnering with, you know, entities that are like, we're really addressing what needs to be addressed, rather than us, you know, creating a solution for a problem that we see, but we're not really on the front end of it, where, you know, so thank you for your feedback.
And wait, my one other thought, and I think beautifully linking to what you just said, is that I think whenever people can see that work is tied directly to their values, their beliefs, right? That is actually very powerful. And I think in this moment in time, um, that matters more than it has mattered like in a long time. Where it's like, if someone can feel like, hey, this actually does tie in with the things that I value and believe in, because they might feel, many people are feeling like huge chunks of my job feel disconnected from my beliefs and values, and I'm not totally sure how to navigate that. So if you are able to connect it back to people's values and beliefs, I think that that can also be a very powerful engagement tool.